The hospice nurse pressed a cassette tape into my hands at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning, and all I could think was that I hadn't known anyone still used cassette tapes. My father-in-law had been gone for 4 minutes. Down the hall, someone's family was singing hymns. I could hear them through the thin wall, low and steady, like a current moving through water. Our room was quiet except for the hum of the machines that had just been switched off. I was the only one there. My husband hadn't answered his phone. My sister-in-law had texted me 2 hours earlier to say she was stuck in a meeting and would come as soon as she could break away. She never came. The nurse, a small woman with silver earrings shaped like moons, said his name had been on the tape for years. That he'd left specific instructions with the facility director. That if no family member was present at the time of death, the tape was to go to me. He said it like he was asking Doe what to do with it, she told me. I didn't even own a cassette player. I met my father-in-law, Walter, 9 years ago at a backyard barbecue in Knoxville. My husband Dennis had warned me about him on the drive over. He's old school, Dennis said, which I came to understand meant Walter said exactly what he thought and didn't apologize for it. He'd shaken my hand like he was meeting a colleague, looked me straight in the eye and said, "You seem like someone who shows up." I hadn't known what to say to that. I just said thank you. We got married the following spring. Dennis's sister Amber gave a toast at the rehearsal dinner that was mostly about herself. Walter had always been kind to me in the way that quiet men are kind, not with words but with attention. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk before Dennis did. He asked about my graduate thesis on environmental policy, even though I'm fairly certain he didn't fully understand what it was about. When Dennis and I moved to Asheville for my job, Walter drove down alone to help us unload the moving truck because Dennis had thrown out his back. Dennis, for his part, meant well. I believe that still. But somewhere in the years between our wedding and Walter's diagnosis, my husband had grown comfortable in the way that some people do. Comfortable with me handling things, comfortable with distance, comfortable with the idea that problems would resolve themselves without his direct involvement. When Walter got his diagnosis, early-stage Parkinson's, then progressing faster than the doctors had predicted, Dennis would call him on Sunday evenings for about 12 minutes. I know because I timed it once. Not out of cruelty. I was just sitting in the kitchen grading papers for the community college course I was teaching, and I noticed that Dennis had hung up and was back on the couch watching basketball before the commercial break ended. Amber visited twice in 3 years. Both times she stayed at a hotel and left within 48 hours. I drove to Knoxville every 6 weeks. I went to his appointments when I could. I learned the names of his nurses. I brought him audiobooks because his hand had gotten too unsteady to hold a paperback comfortably, and he'd always loved reading. We sat in his room and listened to a biography of Eisenhower together. He fell asleep halfway through, and I just sat there in the chair by the window, watching the light change in the parking lot, thinking about nothing in particular. That was 8 months before he died. By the last 2 months, Walter was in the memory care unit. He had good days and difficult days. On a good day, he'd ask me about my students. On a difficult day, he'd call me by his late wife's name, Helen, and I'd just answer to it. I figured it didn't matter. He was somewhere warm when he did that. I wasn't going to drag him back. Dennis made it to the facility 3 times total after Walter was moved to memory care. Each time he stayed less than an hour. "It's hard for me to see him like that," he told me. And I said I understood, because I did understand. It is hard. It doesn't stop being hard. You go anyway. I was the one who sat with Walter on the last Sunday he was truly lucid. He looked at me for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "You have been a good daughter to me, better than I deserved." I told him that wasn't true. He said, "I'm not being modest, I'm being accurate." Then he asked me to hand him the cup of water on the nightstand, and we went back to listening to the radio. I found a cassette player at a Goodwill in West Asheville 3 days after Walter died. It was a Sony Walkman from what looked like the early 90s, with a cracked battery cover held on by a rubber band. I paid $4 for it, bought a pack of AA batteries at the CVS next door, and sat in my car in the parking lot. The tape was labeled in Walter's handwriting. Just my name. Not to whom it may concern. Not for my family. Just my name. In his careful, slightly slanted print. I pressed play. His voice came through the foam headphones like something recovered from another era, which I suppose it was. He'd recorded it 2 years earlier, during a period when his mind was still clear and his hands were still stilly enough to operate a small recorder. He said it like he was asking me cassette tape on purpose. Because, he said, I know my son. If I write a letter, he'll want to read it. If I put it in the mail, Amber will find it first. But nobody looks twice at an old tape in a box. He almost laughed at that. I could hear the beginning of it before he stopped himself. He told me things about his estate that I hadn't known. Walter had been a machinist for 31 years and then a shop foreman, and he had lived simply and saved consistently his entire adult life. He'd bought his house outright in 1987. He'd paid off the car. He had a brokerage account he'd opened in 1994 that had grown, quietly and without anyone's particular attention, for 30 years. Dennis and Amber knew about the house. They didn't know about the brokerage account. Walter told me the account number. He told me the name of the attorney in Knoxville, a woman named Fitzgerald, who had been updating his will for the past decade. He said Miss Fitzgerald had instructions and that I should call her before I called anyone else. Then he was quiet for a moment. I want to tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it as the truth, not as an old man trying to be generous. You are the reason I was not alone in these last years. Not the only reason, but the main one. And I know you didn't do it for anything in return. That's the part that matters to me. He paused. I've done the best I can to make sure you're protected. I'm sorry I couldn't do more while I was still here to do it. I'm sorry about my son. The tape ran for another 40 seconds of silence and then clicked off. I sat in that parking lot for 20 minutes. A woman came out of the Goodwill with a floor lamp and struggled to fit it into her trunk, and I watched her without really seeing her. Then I called Miss Fitzgerald. Dennis had started acting strange about 2 weeks before Walter died. Strange meaning attentive, which was not his baseline. He was home for dinner 3 nights in a row. He asked me how Walter was doing with what seemed like genuine interest. He suggested we take a long weekend to the mountains to clear our heads. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. He'd found out about the brokerage account somehow. I still don't know exactly how, whether Walter had mentioned it in an unguarded moment, or whether Dennis had gone through some paperwork when he visited, or whether he'd simply done the math and realized his father had more assets than he'd let on. What I know is that in the 10 days between Walter's death and my meeting with Miss Fitzgerald, Dennis was solicitous in a way that had the texture of management. He came with me to the meeting. He hadn't asked, he just said he was coming. Said it like it was obvious, and I didn't argue because I didn't yet know what I was walking into. Miss Fitzgerald was a compact woman in her mid-60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had the kind of stillness that comes from decades of sitting across from people in difficult moments. She welcomed us both, offered us coffee, and then opened the file on her desk. Walter had left the house and its contents to Dennis and Amber equally. That was how he'd always said it would go, and he'd followed through. There was a modest savings account, also divided between them. The brokerage account, the one Walter had never mentioned to either of his children, he had transferred into a trust 18 months earlier. The trust's beneficiary was me. I heard Dennis exhale beside me. It wasn't a gasp. It was slower than that, more like something deflating. Ms. Fitzgerald explained that the trust was structured so that neither Dennis's nor my own marital status affected its distribution. Walter had been thorough about that. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said Walter had updated the trust 3 times in the past 4 years, each time ensuring the protections were tighter. He wanted to make sure, she said, that this was yours, not contingent on anything, just yours. On the drive home, Dennis didn't say much for the first 40 minutes. Then he said, I don't understand why he would do it that way. I said, I think you do. He didn't respond to that. We were separated by the following month. It wasn't a dramatic conversation. It was a quiet one, the kind that happens when two people have already been living separately inside the same house for longer than either of them admitted. I told him I thought we'd grown apart in a way that wasn't fixable. He said he thought we just needed to try harder. I said I had been trying. I don't think he disagreed exactly. I think he just hadn't noticed. I moved into an apartment on the north side of Asheville. I kept the cassette player. I took the Eisenhower audiobook that Walter and I had never finished, even though I don't have anything to play it on. Some things you keep not for use, but for what they stand for. Amber called me 6 weeks after the separation. I hadn't spoken to her since the funeral, where she'd arrived 20 minutes after the graveside service ended and told me she'd had a flight issue. She said she thought it was really unfair, what Walter had done, and that she and Dennis were considering whether the trust could be challenged. I listened to her for about 4 minutes. Then I told her, gently, that she was welcome to speak with her own attorney and that I wished her well. She said he always acted like you were the only one who cared about him. I said, I never acted like anything, I just showed up. I hung up after that. I didn't block her number, but I didn't respond when she texted again. I figured she'd say what she needed to say and eventually stop. She did. The divorce was finalized 11 months after Walter's death. Dennis and I were civil throughout the process, which I think is the best thing I can say about the end of that marriage. We managed to be civil. He got what he came in with. I got what I came in with. Plus the trust. We didn't fight about furniture. I think we were both just tired. On the day I signed the final paperwork, I drove to a state park outside the city and walked a trail I'd never done before. It was October and the leaves were at their peak. That specific blazing week in western North Carolina, when the whole ridge looks like it's been set on fire in the best possible way. I didn't listen to anything. I just walked. I thought about Walter on that hike, about the way he'd said you seem like someone who shows up. I thought about how strange it is that sometimes the person who sees you most clearly is not the person you married, but someone adjacent to the marriage, someone who watched from a quieter angle. I thought about his voice on the tape, the way he'd almost laughed. With the trust, I paid off what remained of my student loans and set aside a reserve fund, 6 months of expenses, the way every financial advisor says to do, and almost nobody actually does. I kept my job at the college because I like it, not because I need it. That distinction, it turns out, changes almost everything about how you show up to work. I bought a small house in a neighborhood I'd always liked. A 1940s bungalow with original hardwood floors and a porch that faces west. The first evening I sat on that porch, the sun went down in layers of orange and pink, and I had a cup of tea, and I thought, this is mine. Not contingent on anything, just mine. I still drive past the hospice facility sometimes, not on purpose. It's just on a road I take to get other places. But I never look away when I pass it. I think that's the least I can do, to not look away. There's a woman in my neighborhood who walks her dog every morning around 7, an older woman, must be in her late 70s, always alone. I started saying good morning to her a few months ago. Now we sometimes stop and talk for a few minutes. Her name is Ruth. She has a son in Phoenix who calls on holidays. I bought her soup last winter when she had a bad cold. She looked at me like I'd done something extraordinary, and I wanted to tell her that I hadn't, that I'd just shown up, that it wasn't extraordinary, that it was just the thing you do. I didn't say any of that. I just told her to feel better and to let me know if she needed anything else. Some things you learn from loss. Some things you learn from watching someone die without the people they loved beside them. Some things you don't put into words. You just carry them forward and let them change what you do with a Tuesday morning, or a bowl of soup, or a stranger on a street who might otherwise be invisible. Walter knew that. He'd known it his whole life, I think. He just ran out of time to say it in person. The tape said it for him, and I heard it. And that, in the end, was exactly what he'd hoped. I keep the cassette tape in the top drawer of my nightstand. I don't play it anymore. I've listened to it enough times that I can hear Walter's voice without pressing play. But I like knowing it's there. Something about having it close feels like keeping a promise. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry, whether I feel cheated out of years I gave to a marriage that didn't hold, and I've thought about that a lot, especially in the first months after the divorce, when I'd wake up at 2 in the morning in an apartment that still smelled like fresh paint and feel the full weight of how much had quietly fallen apart. But the honest answer is no, not anymore, because I've come to believe that what we do in private, when no one is watching, when there's no reward on the other end, is the thing that actually shapes what our life becomes. Dennis and Amber made choices in private too. They chose comfort over presence over and over for years, and those choices compounded, the same way Walter's brokerage account compounded, slowly, invisibly, until one day the total was undeniable. That's not karma in any mystical sense. It's just cause and effect. It's just the truth that who we are in the small moments is who we are. Walter understood that. He was a machinist for 31 years. He understood that precision matters, that showing up to do careful work day after day is how things are built that last. He applied that same logic to his savings, to his relationships, to the way he paid attention to people. He saw in the house I recalling not because he was sentimental, but because he was paying attention. That kind of clear-eyed seeing, knowing what something is worth, knowing what a person actually does versus what they say they do. That's a form of intelligence that doesn't show up on any tests. It's the kind you develop by being honest with yourself over a long period of time. And then there's what it takes to actually follow through, to drive to Knoxville every 6 weeks when nobody asked you to sit in a chair by the window while an old man sleeps, to answer to a name that isn't yours because it makes someone feel warm and safe. None of that is glamorous. None of it made the news. I didn't post about it. I just did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I had decided, somewhere early in my marriage, that I was going to be someone who followed through. That decision didn't protect my marriage, but it protected me, the version of me I could live with when everything else fell away. I think about Ruth, my neighbor, sometimes when I'm putting soup in a container to bring over. I think about how she looked at me like I'd done something extraordinary, and I think this is the thing I want to hold on to, that we have shrunk our expectations of each other so far down that basic decency now reads as exceptional. That's not an indictment of Ruth or of anyone in particular. It's just something worth noticing, worth pushing back against. Walter left me more than money. He left me a clear demonstration of what a life built on paying attention actually produces. Not just the trust, but the relationships, the dignity, the knowledge that when his last morning came, someone who genuinely loved him was in the room. I want to be that person. I want to keep being that person, not for what it might leave me with in the end, but because I've seen what the alternative looks like from the inside, and it is a particular kind of loneliness that I do not want. The take goes on for 40 seconds of silence at the end before it clicks off. I used to wonder why. Now I think he just wanted to give me a moment to sit with it. I'm still sitting with it.